The printer started coughing out pages, and I watched my daughter's face change with each one that landed in the pile. We stood in the bursar's office at Crestwood University, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Tessa's fiancé Brandon leaned against the counter with that smirk I'd learned to hate over the past 6 months. His mother Lydia stood beside him, designer purse clutched like a weapon, her lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. They'd brought me here to prove a point, to show everyone how I'd abandoned my only child. The clerk behind the desk kept printing, her eyes widening with each page. "This is extensive," she said quietly, glancing between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral. 7 years of silence were about to speak louder than I ever could. Lydia stepped forward, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "Read it," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Aloud, please. We'd all like to hear exactly how much help Naomi provided." The clerk's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the first page. "Payments made by Heart Foundation," the clerk began, her voice uncertain. "Anonymous donor designation." Tessa laughed once, a brittle sound that cracked something inside my chest. She'd been so angry lately, so convinced that I'd turned my back on her when she needed me most. Brandon had worked hard to cultivate that anger, feeding it with carefully chosen words and conveniently timed coincidences. I'd watched my daughter slip away from me like sand through fingers, and I'd said nothing because speaking would have broken a promise I made to a dying man. The clerk continued scanning the document. "However, there's a verified identification number linked to the account." Lydia tilted her head, studying me like I was a specimen under glass. "And whose identification would that be?" she asked. The students gathered in the lobby had gone quiet now, sensing drama unfolding. A few held up phones, recording. This generation documented everything, turned private moments into public spectacle. I supposed that would work in my favor today. The truth had a way of spreading when given the right platform. "Naomi Hart," the clerk said, and the name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Tessa's face emptied of color, of expression, of everything except confusion. The clerk slid a stack of donor forms across the counter, each one bearing my signature in blue ink. 7 years of careful anonymity, 7 years of keeping my promise, all laid bare in a government office on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd signed each form the same way, my handwriting unchanged despite the grief that had nearly broken me in the early years. Brandon straightened from his casual lean, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to something harder to read. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. "That's interesting," he said, his voice carrying that edge I'd learned meant trouble was coming. "Because I have text messages here showing my mother asked for help with Tessa's tuition last year, and Naomi refused. Multiple times." He held up the phone, angling it so the gathering crowd could see. I saw spliced conversations, words I'd never written arranged in patterns I'd never created. The timestamps were wrong, the font slightly off. But most people wouldn't notice those details. I watched faces in the crowd shift from sympathy to suspicion. Brandon had always been good at manipulating narratives, at taking truth and twisting it just enough to serve his purposes. That's what made him dangerous. Liars were easy to expose, but Brandon dealt in half-truths and careful omissions. "May we view the Bursar's internal notes?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Years of working night shifts as a bookkeeper had taught me patience, had taught me that numbers always told the truth if you knew where to look. The clerk hesitated, glancing at her supervisor who stood in the doorway of an inner office. The supervisor nodded once, and the clerk reached beneath the counter for a leather binder marked with gold letters, "Special Instructions." My hands were sweating. I hadn't been sure these notes still existed. When I'd made the arrangements 7 years ago, the previous bursar had promised discretion. But staff changed, systems upgraded, and paper trails had a way of disappearing. The binder landed on the counter with a soft thud. Lydia's perfectly painted eyebrows drew together in the first sign of uncertainty I'd seen from her all day. The clerk opened the binder, and her expression softened as she read. "There are detailed instructions here," she said. "Dating back 7 years. She turned the binder so we could all see the handwritten notes in the margins, notes I'd forgotten I'd written. Keep it anonymous. Tell her she earned it through her own merit. The words blurred as I read them, my vision swimming with unshed tears. Add meal credits during finals week. She forgets to eat when she's stressed. The clerk's voice was gentle now. There are notes for every semester. Adjustments to housing stipends when her roommate situation fell through. Lab fee coverage when her grant came up short. Emergency meal credits added without explanation. Someone in the gathering crowd whispered, "That's love." But Lydia inhaled sharply, her designer nails tapping against her purse. "Or control," she said, her voice cutting through the softening mood like a blade. Manipulating a young woman's life from the shadows. Making her dependent without her knowledge. That's not love, that's puppeteering. Murmurs of agreement rippled through some of the students. Brandon nodded, his expression grave, playing the concerned protector perfectly. "Then explain why her transfer request bounced last week," Brandon said, his voice rising with indignation. "Tessa tried to access funds for our apartment deposit, and the account was suddenly empty." "Where did that money go, Naomi?" Tessa's eyes found mine, searching for answers I hadn't been allowed to give. The account had been flagged, frozen by the bank's fraud detection system. I'd spent 3 days on the phone trying to resolve it, but by then Brandon had already spun the story his way. I pulled out my phone, navigating to my banking app with fingers that wanted to shake but didn't. "The account was flagged for suspicious activity," I said, turning the screen to show the fraud alert notification. An unrecognized device attempted to access it. The bank froze the funds pending investigation. The clerk leaned forward, squinting at my screen. "May I pull the security log?" she asked. I nodded. She typed quickly, and her printer hummed to life again. When the page emerged, she held it up to the light, frowning. "The suspicious access came from a corporate VPN," she said slowly. "IP address traced to a business network, not a residential connection." The clerk's frown deepened as she scanned the security log. According to this, someone using the name Brandon C. called our financial aid office that same day, asking about procedures for adding himself as an authorized payee on student accounts. The lobby went very quiet. Eyes shifted to Brandon, whose jaw flexed once, twice. His casual confidence was developing cracks around the edges. "I was trying to help," he said, his voice defensive now instead of accusatory. "Tessa needed money quickly for our security deposit. I thought if I could be added to the account, I could facilitate the transfer. It was meant to be a bridge loan. For us. For our future." The way he said us made my skin crawl. Like Tessa was a possession he'd acquired, like her future was something he controlled. I'd seen this pattern before, years ago, in my own mother's marriage. The slow erosion of autonomy disguised as care. Lydia stepped forward, her posture protective of her son. "Tessa owes us loyalty," she said, her voice low and hard. "We've supported her emotionally through this difficult period. We've helped her see clearly when her judgment was clouded by maternal guilt." The clerk's expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something cooler. "According to our records, there were no restrictions placed by Ms. Hart on the account," she said carefully. "The funds were designated for Tessa's educational expenses, with discretionary allowance for housing and reasonable living costs. Any attempt to redirect those funds to non-educational purposes would violate the grant conditions." Tessa's voice came out small and confused. "Mom, why would you hide this?" The question I'd been dreading for 7 years. How could I explain that hiding was love, that silence was the gift her father had begged me to give? I closed my eyes and saw him again, saw the hospice room with its mechanical bed and morphine drip. Saw his hand in mine, the weight of him already fading. "Let her think she did it herself," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible over the oxygen machine. "Don't turn love into debt. Give her wings, but let her believe she grew them." I'd promised. And I'd kept that promise even when it cost me my daughter's affection, even when silence made me the villain in her story. "Your father asked me not to tell you," I said finally, the words scraping out of my throat like broken glass. Before he died, he made me promise. He wanted you to feel accomplished, not obligated. He didn't want you spending your college years feeling guilty or indebted. Tessa's eyes filled with tears, but Brandon moved quickly, positioning himself between us. How convenient, Lydia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Blame a dead man who can't defend himself. Who can't confirm or deny this touching deathbed scene. Rage burned hot in my chest, but I forced it down. Anger was what they wanted, what they needed to paint me as unstable, unreasonable. Instead, I pulled out my phone again and navigated to a folder I'd labeled simply for Tessa. Your father recorded something, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He asked me to send it to you on graduation day, but I think you need to see it now. I pressed play on the video file, and suddenly my husband's face filled the small screen. His hair was already gone from the chemotherapy, his face gaunt, but his eyes were bright with the fierce love that had defined our marriage. Tessa, my husband's recorded voice said, and I watched my daughter's face crumble. If you're watching this, it means Mom kept her promise to wait. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Everything you've accomplished, every scholarship, every achievement, that was all you. Your mom was your quiet wings, but you were the one who learned to fly. Tears streamed down Tessa's face. Several students in the crowd were crying too, phones still recording but hands shaking. The video continued, my husband's voice growing weaker but no less determined. Don't let anyone make you feel small for accepting help. Don't let anyone turn love into leverage. Your mom gave without asking for anything back because that's what real love does. It doesn't demand gratitude, it doesn't keep score. It just gives. Brandon reached for Tessa's phone, his expression darkening. We're leaving, he said firmly. This is obviously an emotional manipulation tactic. We don't have to stand here and be subjected to this. But Tessa pulled away from him, clutching the phone to her chest. I want to hear the rest, she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. Students in the lobby shifted position, and I realized they'd formed a loose barrier between us and the exit. Let her finish, one young man said quietly. Others nodded, their faces set with that particular kind of righteous determination that only the young can muster. The clerk printed another document, this one several pages thick. Housing stipend adjustments, she read. Lab fee coverage. Emergency meal credits. Health insurance continuation. Textbook assistance. Winter break housing extension. Each line item represented a moment I'd seen my daughter struggling and stepped in silently. The time her roommate moved out mid-semester, leaving her with double rent. The expensive chemistry lab materials her grant didn't cover. The week she got sick during finals and couldn't afford both medicine and food. The textbooks that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. I'd watched from the shadows, a ghost mother loving a daughter who thought herself abandoned. Brandon's phone dinged loudly in the tense silence. He glanced at it reflexively, and his face went pale. The screen was angled enough that I caught a glimpse of the preview. Subject, investigation notice, and something about VPN misuse before he tilted it away. The email preview had been visible for maybe 3 seconds, but several students had seen it. Phones tilted, screenshots captured, and information spread through the crowd in silent, digital wildfire. This was the power of witnesses, the reason I'd agreed to meet here instead of somewhere private. Truth needed an audience to survive against lies. Brandon shoved his phone into his pocket, but the damage was done. The clerk's eyes had sharpened with professional concern. We take unauthorized access to student financial systems very seriously, she said carefully. Lydia straightened, her composure snapping back into place like armor. My attorney will be fascinated by these accusations, she said, her voice cold and precise. Slander, defamation, public humiliation. This little performance you've orchestrated, Naomi, will cost you everything. I'd been waiting for this threat. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, worn soft from the number of times I'd carried it without using it. I have documentation, I said. Emails. Text message logs. Recorded calls. Would you like the clerk to review those as well? Lydia's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear beneath the fury. I slid the printed emails across the counter. The clerk picked them up, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. These are communications between Ms. Lydia Crane and Tessa Hart, she said slowly. They detail pressure to sign financial aid refunds into what's described as a family investment opportunity. The emails were damning in their casual cruelty. Lydia's voice came through in crisp corporate language, but the message was clear. Tessa's financial aid wasn't really hers, was an obligation to family, should be pooled for everyone's benefit. Brandon was CC'd on every single message. The letterhead bore Lydia's company logo, an investment firm that promised guaranteed returns to select clients. That's private correspondence, Lydia snapped, reaching for the papers. You had no right to access those. But Tessa's voice cut through the tension. She didn't access them, Mom gave them to me months ago. I forwarded them to her when you wouldn't stop calling about the investment scheme. The crowd murmured. Someone said scheme loud enough for everyone to hear. Brandon's face had gone from pale to flushed, his control slipping with each revelation. The clerk set down the emails and picked up her phone, pressing an extension number. Coercion affecting student financial aid is a serious campus policy violation, she said, her voice calm but firm. I need to notify our student advocacy office. Security was mentioned. Not as a threat, but as procedure. 2 officers arrived within minutes, their presence gentle but unmistakable. They positioned themselves near the entrance, not blocking it, but certainly making exit less casual. Tessa turned to Brandon, and I saw my daughter's face transform from confused to analytical. She was piecing together the timeline, seeing patterns she'd missed while caught in the middle of manipulation. Did you plan to use my financial aid as collateral? She asked him, her voice quiet but dangerous. For your mother's investment scheme? Is that why you kept pushing me to sign those transfer forms? Brandon's jaw worked. He glanced at his mother, at the security officers, at the phone still recording. It was just a bridge loan, he said, his voice lacking conviction. To help us get started together. You make it sound predatory when it was meant to be supportive. Tessa flinched like he'd slapped her. The phrase bridge loan hung in the air, heavy with implications about burning bridges and crossing them. One of the security officers stepped forward slightly, not intervening but present. Ma'am, he said to Tessa, his voice respectful. Do you feel safe in this conversation? The question was protocol, but it mattered. It gave Tessa permission to acknowledge discomfort, to set boundaries without feeling guilty. She nodded slowly. I'm okay. But I'd like them to step back. The officers positioned themselves between Tessa and Brandon, creating physical space. Lydia's control cracked further. She stepped into my personal space, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. You're destroying her family, she hissed. Turning her against people who actually care about her future. This crusade of yours, this need to be the hero, it's pathological. I'd prepared for this moment too. From my purse, I pulled another envelope. This is a cease and desist letter, I said calmly. Drafted by Legal Aid Services. It documents harassment and disparagement. If you continue to contact me or interfere with Tessa's access to her educational funds, I'll file a restraining order. One of the officers gently gestured for Lydia to step back. She did, but her eyes promised retaliation. The clerk cleared her throat. There's one more donor note, she said, her voice soft. It's dated from just before the account was established. My chest tightened. I'd forgotten about that note, written in the raw weeks after my husband's funeral when grief sat like stones in my lungs. The clerk read aloud. If she falls, if she struggles, extend help but don't let her know it's me. Let her feel capable of rising on her own. Love shouldn't be a leash. The room was silent except for muffled sniffles. Several students were openly crying now. Even the security officers' expressions had softened. Tessa's voice came out broken. Then who sent those refusal texts? The ones Brandon showed earlier? I'd been waiting for this question too. From my phone, I pulled up a document my cell carrier had provided after I'd reported the fraud. This is metadata analysis, I said. It shows forwarding rules were set up on my number, routing certain incoming messages to an external device before I ever saw them. Auto-replies were generated from that device, not from my phone. The auto-replies had been clever, using my language patterns, my signature phrases. But the metadata didn't lie about origin points. I held up the printed chain analysis, the technical details probably meaningless to most people but damning in their implications. The forwarding rules were established from a contact saved as L. Crane Family Services in a cloud backup I didn't authorize. Lydia's laugh sounded like breaking glass. That's absurd. You're claiming I somehow hacked your phone and impersonated you? Do you hear yourself? You sound paranoid, unstable. But Tessa was staring at her future mother-in-law with dawning horror. You called yourself Family Services in her phone, she asked. That's what you labeled your contact? It was a small detail, but revealing. The corporate language, the assumption of authority. The idea that Lydia saw herself as a service provider to our family rather than a member of it. One of the security officers spoke quietly into his radio. The clerk was making notes, her handwriting quick and precise. Everything was being documented now, officially. Brandon's phone chimed again. Another email notification. He didn't look at it this time, but his shoulders hunched forward in defeat. Whatever that investigation entailed, it was progressing quickly. Tessa took a shaky breath. I want the truth, she said, her voice cracking. Here. Now. All of it. I told her everything. About her father's diagnosis, the 6 months of treatment that gave us hope before taking it away. About the life insurance policy that paid out more than expected because of a double indemnity clause. About my decision to work night shifts so I could funnel every available dollar into her education without touching the account her father had earmarked for her future. About the promise I'd made to a dying man who loved his daughter enough to want her to feel powerful instead of pitiful. Tessa listened, tears streaming down her face. The crowd listened too, dozens of students hearing a story about love that didn't announce itself, love that worked in shadows because sunshine would have burned the gift to ash. I should have told you sooner, I admitted. But breaking a promise to your father felt like losing him again. And then Brandon started isolating you. And I thought if I revealed everything, he'd twist it somehow. He's good at that, taking truth and making it ugly. Brandon started to protest, but Tessa held up her hand. Don't, she said. Please don't. She turned to the clerk. What are my options here? For the account, for the funds, for everything? The clerk explained the formal process. Tessa could sign a form revoking any third-party access requests, could set up two-factor authentication, could require in-person verification for any major transfers. She could also file a complaint about the attempted coercion regarding the investment scheme. Tessa signed everything. Her signature was shaky but determined. Brandon watched, his expression shifting from angry to resigned to something that might have been relief. Maybe part of him was tired of being his mother's weapon. You'll regret this, Lydia said, but her voice had lost its edge. She sounded tired now, an aging woman watching her control slip away. Brandon's phone chimed a third time. This time he looked at it and went gray. I need to make a call, he muttered. To my supervisor. There's been a complaint about unauthorized VPN usage for personal business during work hours. They're recommending suspension pending inquiry. The crowd stirred. Someone laughed, not cruelly but with the satisfaction of seeing karma work quickly. Phones captured every moment. This story would spread across campus, across social media. By tomorrow, everyone would know about the mother who loved in silence and the manipulators who tried to exploit that silence. Security logged all the evidence. The clerk made copies for student files. The machinery of institutional accountability ground into motion slowly but inevitably. Brandon's job was on the line. Lydia's reputation was circulating through dozens of phones in real time. But I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. This wasn't revenge. It was survival. It was protecting my daughter from people who saw her as a resource to be managed instead of a person to be loved. Lydia gathered her designer purse and what remained of her dignity. "I'll bury you in court," she said, but the threat rang hollow now. Too much had been documented, witnessed, recorded. "I have evidence," I said quietly. "Timestamps, bank fraud reports, security footage from the campus entrance showing you following Tessa to intimidate her about signing those forms. Audio recordings of phone calls where you explicitly stated Tessa owes your family for emotional support. Everything is logged, everything is documented." One security officer was already uploading files to the student advocacy database. The other was speaking into his radio again, probably updating his supervisor about potential legal implications. Tessa's voice broke through the administrative buzz. "Mom, if you were helping all along, why did you let me hate you?" The question I'd been dreading most. "I chose your freedom over being thanked," I said, and the words felt like pulling shrapnel from a wound. "I thought if you knew, you'd feel obligated. You'd make choices based on gratitude instead of genuine desire. You'd shape your life around paying me back instead of building what you wanted." I took a breath, steadying myself. But I was wrong. Freedom without truth isn't freedom at all. It's just a different kind of cage. I built you a prison of secrets and called it love. Tessa moved toward me, and suddenly we were holding each other for the first time in months. She smelled like her father's shampoo, the brand she'd switched to after he died. Her shoulders shook with sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry I believed them." "Don't apologize for being human," I said. "Apologize for what you do next, not what you did when you didn't know better." We stood there while students gave us space, while security finished their reports, while the clerk printed final documentation. Brandon had moved to a corner, phone pressed to his ear, having the career-ending conversation with his supervisor. Lydia stood alone, her armor finally cracked enough to show the small, frightened woman underneath. "There's one last thing," I said to Tessa. "Something I need to tell you about." "Your father set up a trust," I explained, guiding Tessa to a chair in the lobby. "Separate from the scholarship fund. It's substantial, meant for graduate school or starting a business or whatever dream you have that needs capital." Tessa's eyes widened. "How much?" "Enough to matter. But there are conditions." I pulled out the trust documents I'd been carrying for years, waiting for the right moment. "You have to demonstrate financial independence first. Your own apartment, your own budget, proof that you can manage money without coercion from anyone, including me." The terms had seemed harsh when my husband first explained them. But he'd understood something I hadn't. He'd known that money without boundaries was a trap, that love without conditions could become control. The trust required Tessa to undergo financial counseling, to maintain independent housing for 6 months, to show she could make decisions without external pressure. Only then would the funds become accessible. "Why so many hoops?" Tessa asked. "Because he wanted you to be unbreakable," I said. "He wanted you to know your own strength before giving you resources that others might try to exploit. It was a gift that demanded growth, that refused to rescue without teaching resilience first. The kind of love that trusted enough to challenge." "There's also a protective clause," I added, watching Tessa's face carefully. "If anyone attempts to control or coerce you regarding these funds, if anyone tries to manipulate you into using them for purposes you don't genuinely want, their access to any information about the trust is permanently revoked." I pulled out the trigger documentation I'd prepared with the attorney who'd managed my husband's estate. "Brandon and Lydia's behavior today qualifies as attempted coercion. I'm filing the trigger, which means they'll never be able to access information about the trust amount, distribution schedule, or conditions. If they try to investigate or interfere, the trust diverts a matching grant to a women in STEM fund in your name. It was the ultimate protection, the final boundary. My husband had anticipated this scenario. He'd known that money attracted predators, that young women were particularly vulnerable to financial manipulation disguised as love. He'd built a fortress around our daughter's future, and I was finally fulfilling my role as guardian of that fortress. Lydia's face went sheet white as she processed the implications. Brandon actually stumbled, catching himself against the wall. They'd been planning on those funds, counting on that money for their schemes. The trust documents had just destroyed whatever future they'd envisioned. "I'll help you," I said to Tessa, my voice firm but gentle. But with boundaries this time. Real ones that protect both of us. I outlined what that meant. I'd contribute to her independent housing search, but she'd sign the lease herself. I'd help with her budget planning, but she'd manage her own accounts. I'd be available for advice, but I wouldn't make decisions for her. We'd attend family therapy together to rebuild trust damaged by months of manipulation and years of secrets. "These are the terms," I said. "If you want my support, you accept my boundaries. If you want my love, you accept that it comes with respect for your autonomy. No more rescuing without permission, no more silence disguised as sacrifice." Tessa looked at the trust documents, at the therapy referrals, at the financial independence requirements. She looked at Brandon in the corner, still on his disastrous phone call. At Lydia, whose designer armor couldn't hide the defeat in her eyes. At the student still recording, bearing witness to transformation. "I accept," Tessa said. She signed the boundary agreement I drafted, the one requiring her to maintain separate finances from Brandon, to attend therapy, to demonstrate independent decision-making. She signed without hesitation, her signature growing steadier with each stroke of the pen. We walked out of that bursar's office together, mother and daughter reunited not by pretending the past hadn't happened, but by acknowledging it honestly. The crowd parted for us, and several students actually applauded. One young woman approached as we reached the parking lot. "My mom did something similar," she said, tears in her eyes. "Anonymous help because she didn't want me to feel obligated. I just learned about it last semester. Thank you for sharing your story." Over the next weeks, things shifted rapidly. The university was so moved by my husband's approach to anonymous giving that they renamed their donor pilot program. It became the Quiet Wings Fund, established in honor of Naomi and Thomas Hart. A plaque went up in the financial aid office explaining the philosophy. Love that doesn't announce itself, support that builds strength instead of dependence. Brandon's company suspended him pending investigation into VPN misuse and potential fraud. Lydia's attorney quietly withdrew after reviewing the evidence. Her investment firm faced scrutiny when several former clients came forward with similar stories of coercion and manipulation. 3 months after that confrontation, Tessa posted on social media. The post was simple, just a photo of her father's video message and a caption that read, "To the parents who help in silence, who love without keeping score, who give wings instead of leashes, I see you now. And I'm grateful." The comments flooded in within hours. Thousands of people sharing their own stories of quiet love, of parents who sacrificed without announcing it, of support that came wrapped in independence instead of obligation. The post went viral, shared across platforms, sparking conversations about healthy family dynamics and the difference between support and control. I framed a screenshot of that post. It hangs in my kitchen now, next to a photo of my husband holding newborn Tessa. He's smiling in that picture, proud and hopeful and so alive. I like to think he'd be proud of how this ended, how his quiet love created ripples that spread far beyond our small family. Some mornings, I still wake up at odd hours, my body trained by years of night shifts. But now instead of heading to an empty office, I make coffee and watch the sunrise. I think about my daughter in her independent apartment, making her own choices, building her own life. I think about all the other daughters and sons learning to fly on wings they didn't know their parents had quietly helped them grow. And I understand finally that love's greatest act isn't the sacrifice itself but knowing when to reveal that sacrifice, knowing when silence becomes harm and when truth becomes healing. My husband knew that. He built that wisdom into every aspect of his final gift to our daughter. Now I carry that wisdom forward, teaching it to anyone willing to listen. Love quietly, yes. But also love wisely. Know when to speak and when to stay silent. Know the difference between supporting and controlling, between helping and hovering. Most importantly, know that the greatest gift you can give is the belief that they can fly, even when you're the one who helped build their wings.